They said, "Grandma believes everything," and they laughed like it was a joke stitched in gold, small and harmless, something light to toss across the table between the salad and the roast potatoes. But it wasn't small to me. It was a knife with a sugar handle, and I heard my grandson's voice, clear as glass, carrying those words into the room, and I felt something close quietly inside my chest. I remember the way the fork slipped from my hand and hit the plate with that thin, embarrassed sound, the clink that made everyone glance for half a second and then look away, as if the spill belonged only to my clumsiness and not to what had just been said. The television in the living room hummed with some game show. The overhead light was too bright. The gravy was starting to film over in the bowl, and my daughter was still talking about mortgage rates while my son-in-law scrolled through his phone, both of them smiling in that impatient way adults do when children say something funny at an old woman's expense. My Leo smirked, proud of himself, elbows on the table like he'd leveled up in the family hierarchy by discovering I was gullible. "Grandma believes everything," he repeated, slightly louder, and this time he nudged his sister, and they both giggled, and my daughter's mouth twitched, and she said, "Don't tease," but there was no spine in it, no real rebuke, just that soft complicity that says the joke is basically fine. If you want to know who I am, start there. At the moment, a boy I once held against my chest while he screamed at 3 a.m, a boy whose fever I checked with trembling fingers, whose shoelaces I tied, whose nightmares I walked out of his room with like smoke on my clothes, announced to a room full of people that my trust was something stupid, something simple, something to step on. I am 82 now. I live alone in a small apartment, above a laundromat that never sleeps. The machines below churn and breathe and rattle like a tired mechanical heart. And at night, the neon sign in the window throws red and blue rectangles onto my ceiling. So I fall, asleep in the light, as if I had parked myself inside a fading ambulance. My walls are thin, my kettle is old, my knees ache when the rain takes its time leaving. But my mind is not the soft, leaky thing they like to imagine when they speak about me in past tense while I'm still in the room. People think the story starts with the missing jewelry. But no, jewels are metal and stone and memory is mine, fiercely mine, for as long as I am breathing. The story starts with that sentence and how nobody took it back. I had come that Sunday carrying my usual offerings, the way old women do when they still believe they can buy themselves a place at the table with potato salad and a lemon cake. My hands smelled of soap and sugar. The jewelry box, the real one, stayed at home on my dresser, a little square of dark wood with a crack along the hinge and a velvet lining worn flat where my rings used to kiss the same spot. Those pieces were not trophies or investments. They were the notes of a life. The slender gold chain with the tiny sapphire was from my husband on the day I turned 40, the day he said, "It is not much, but you deserve pretty things that are yours and not borrowed." The bracelet with the 3 small charms was a gift to myself when I paid off the last of the house, when I realized no one could take the roof from over my daughters' and Leo's heads as long as I kept working and did not complain, and I did not complain. The other ring, the simple band with the milky opal, belonged to my mother, who wore it until her fingers swelled and she pressed it into my palm in the hospital and said, "Keep it. Let it remind you I wasn't always this small." Those pieces glowed louder than they looked. They carried names, hands, promises, and all the small days between big days. That's what they were. So when the laughter came, it wasn't only about believing everything. it was about who they thought I was now. A frail woman with soft edges and cloudy thoughts, easy to reassure, easy to nudge aside, reliable for casseroles and child care and small loans until Friday, but unreliable if she said something uncomfortable, like, "I know that ring was on my dresser," or "I heard what you just said and it hurt." At that table, with the roast and the salad and the phones and the fake concern about my blood pressure, I watched Leo's face carefully, the angle of his jaw, the way teenagers look when they're testing how far they can go without consequence. His eyes flicked to my daughter's, and there it was, the quick exchange that told me something I wasn't supposed to see, that I existed more as a topic than a person now, a project to be managed, a narrative to be controlled. "She worries too much," my daughter had told a neighbor once, thinking I couldn't hear. "She forgets. Sometimes she imagines things." I remember that too. I remember everything they are so sure is slipping away. I cut another piece of meat I didn't want and chewed it slowly, and I said nothing, because if I had spoken in that moment, the words would have come out like a broken glass, too sharp, and they would have decided I was getting emotional, which is what they call it when an old woman refuses to be a sentimental mascot. Instead, I asked Leo, gently, how his classes were, and he smirked and said fine, and avoided my gaze. And I noticed for the first time the twitch in his fingers and the restless way his leg bounced under the table, the shadows under his eyes that no one else seemed to see or want to see. I noticed the way his voice went flat when his mother called him my genius in front of the guests. I've lived long enough to know the sound of a soul that has already started to bargain with itself. After dinner, I washed dishes while my daughter dried them carelessly, more focused on her phone than the plates. And she said, "Mom, don't take Leo seriously. You know how kids are." And I nodded, and I almost let it go. But then she said, in that voice she reserves for me now, sweet and firm and edged like a bank letter, "You do believe everything. That's why people took advantage of you all your life. You're lucky nothing terrible ever happened." That was when I understood. First they use your goodness, then they blame you for having it. Later, when I went home on the bus in my good coat with the missing button, I walked up the narrow stairs to my apartment, sat on the edge of my bed, and opened the jewelry box just to see something that still obeyed me. The velvet hollows where the rings slept, the smell of old perfume from a bottle long finished, the soft click of the lid. Everything was in its place that night. The theft did not happen yet. The worst part hadn't either. I was still the woman who believed that if you gave enough, loved enough, stayed soft enough, the people you raised would never sharpen themselves on you. I am telling you this so you understand. When I say, my grandson laughed and said Grandma believes everything, I am not reciting an anecdote. I am giving you the coordinates of the first crack. I am telling you where the floor began to tilt under my feet, long before I opened that box one morning and saw empty spaces where my life used to shine. The day I discovered the jewelry was gone began with sunlight that looked kinder than it meant to be. It came through the blinds in thin, deliberate stripes, like bars of quiet gold. And for a few seconds, I just lay there, letting it paint over my hands, pretending it was warmth and not another reminder that time has texture and keeps pressing down, whether you want it or not. I had woken early to prepare for the small anniversary I still kept for myself, my late husband's birthday. Every year since he passed, I would take out the sapphire necklace he had given me when we still knew how to laugh together, polish it gently with a square of soft cloth, and wear it for the day. A silly ritual, maybe, But rituals are what keep widows from turning to dust. The apartment smelled faintly of starch and detergent from the laundromat below, a smell that never really left the air, but I liked it. It reminded me of order, of clean beginnings, of something being made right again after use. I remember humming quietly, a tune from some forgotten movie, as I opened my dresser drawer. It took me a moment to notice the emptiness. The lid of the jewelry box was slightly ajar, as if it had been closed in a hurry. I remember how ordinary that moment was. No dramatic music, no sudden gasp, just the stillness of a room rearranged by absence. The necklace, the opal ring, the gold bracelet with its small charms, all gone. The velvet was bare, except for the indentation their weight had left behind. I touched the hollow spaces with my fingers, half expecting to feel their outlines the way you can still feel a wedding ring after you've taken it off. For a few seconds, I thought maybe I had moved them myself, maybe during one of those cleaning sprees when I tried to reclaim control over the slow unraveling of my home. I checked every drawer, every box, even the kitchen cabinet where I sometimes hid things I was afraid to lose, because you always suspect yourself first. That's what long habit teaches women like me. When I realized they were truly gone, I didn't cry. I just stood there, listening to the low hum of the building and the small tick of the clock, and a cold clarity began to spread inside me. Theft is not about objects. It's about confirmation. Confirmation that someone believes you won't fight back. I thought about the last time Leo had been here, 2 weeks before, when he'd asked if he could stay for the afternoon because Mom needed a break. He'd rummaged through my drawers, looking for batteries for his headphones, teasing me about how old-fashioned my apartment was, laughing when he found the faded photographs in the top drawer. "You keep everything," he said, "even dust." I had told him gently that some dust deserves respect. He rolled his eyes, then hugged me quickly, the way people hug when they're already thinking about leaving. When he left, I found the drawer half open, but I didn't think much of it. He was careless, like his mother. It was easy to forgive. I kept forgiving as a kind of religion. I called my daughter that morning, my voice calm, too calm maybe. "Something's missing," I said. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause filled with silent negotiation. What's the easiest way to manage this conversation without making it a scene? "What's missing, Mom?" she asked finally, her tone the same one she used when talking to customer service. "The jewelry box is empty," I said. "The necklace, the ring, the bracelet, all gone." She sighed. Not fear, not sympathy, just fatigue. "Maybe you misplaced them. You have so many little hiding spots. Remember last year when you thought someone stole your passport and it was under your sweaters?" "This isn't like that," I said. The box was open. Someone went through my things. "Mom, please, don't jump to conclusions." I could hear voices in the background. Her husband talking about work, Leo laughing faintly. She lowered her voice. "You know, sometimes memory plays tricks. Maybe you should write down where you keep things. It's normal." The word normal landed like a slap, soft but deliberate. "Did Leo say anything?" I asked. The silence returned, sharper this time. "Leo? Why would Leo? Mom, no. He's 16. Don't start something like that. He was here. He looked through that drawer. He was looking for batteries," she said quickly. "You told me yourself." Her voice brightened artificially, a tone I'd learned to fear. "Why don't you rest a bit, Mom? I'll stop by tomorrow after work, okay?" And then, before I could answer, "Love you," and the line went dead. I stood there, with the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone, the mechanical proof that someone has chosen to leave a conversation unfinished. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed. For a long time, I stared at the open jewelry box. My husband's laughter came back to me, not as a sound but as a pressure behind my ribs. He used to say I was too trusting, that the world would eat me alive if I kept giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. I used to tell him that trust is like bread. You can't live without it, even if it goes stale sometimes. But sitting there, in that small room that smelled of detergent and quiet betrayal, I realized he might have been right. Later that afternoon, my daughter arrived after all. She brought groceries I hadn't asked for and a bouquet of pale flowers that looked like apologies. She kissed my cheek distractedly, then started rearranging the kitchen shelves as if reorganizing my space would reset my mind. "See, everything's here," she said cheerfully. "Maybe the box just looks emptier because you haven't worn the jewelry lately." I took her hand gently and led her to the bedroom. "Look," I said, showing her the empty velvet. "It's gone. You can see the marks where the pieces used to be." She glanced, then looked away quickly. "It's just things, Mom," she said. "Don't make yourself sick over it." I felt something inside me break and settle into a new shape, something quieter and colder. I said nothing. I let her fill the silence with her bright chatter about traffic and bills and new recipes. When she left, I noticed the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the hallway, a scent that once meant comfort, but now felt like erasure. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment Leo laughed at that dinner, the way he said, "Grandma believes everything," and how everyone had laughed with him. The sentence grew larger in my mind, echoing through every corner of the room. Believe everything. Yes, I had believed that kindness was armor, that love was inheritance, that family meant safety. But belief without reciprocation is just blindness. Around 3 a.m, I rose, made tea, and sat by the window. The street below was slick from rain, the puddles reflecting the cheap neon sign from the laundromat. I watched the city breathe, and I felt old in a way I hadn't before. Not the kind of old that aches in the knees, but the kind that aches in the soul, when you realize you've been mistaken about the people you built your world around. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That my grandson stole from me? That my daughter preferred to doubt my sanity rather than her child's integrity? The truth is, I wasn't afraid of not being believed. I was afraid of being believed and still dismissed. There's nothing more humiliating than being right and watching people act as if you're wrong because it's more convenient. So I did nothing that night. I sat in my chair, hands around the mug, and listened to the sounds of water dripping from the roof, the slow rhythm of a building breathing through the dark. The next morning, when my daughter called to ask if I was feeling better, I said yes. I lied smoothly, the way women my age have learned to lie in order to keep their dignity intact. I told her I must have misplaced the jewelry after all, and she sounded relieved, almost triumphant, as if my self-doubt restored the natural order of things. "See," she said, "I told you it would turn up." It never did. But something else appeared instead, a thought, small but persistent, that I kept turning over in my mind. If they think you believe everything, maybe it's time to let them see what happens when you stop. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment the story began to move forward, the moment I crossed the invisible line between being the woman who waited for explanations and the woman who quietly began to build her own. The quietness that followed was worse than any open argument could have been. It was the kind of silence that doesn't grow out of peace, but out of careful avoidance. Like when people step around a sleeping dog they're afraid might bite. After that day, after the jewelry vanished, and the phone conversations thinned into polite check-ins, I could feel the air between us curdle into something watchful. My daughter stopped dropping by unannounced, and when she did visit, she was never alone. She brought Leo or her husband, or some errand that made the visit sound practical, never emotional. She no longer stayed long enough to share a cup of tea. The old warmth that used to fill my kitchen when she came for advice or gossip had turned brittle, a conversation of lists and reminders, as if she had been reassigned to a job she didn't like but couldn't quit. She spoke to me with that over-careful patience people reserve for the fragile and the inconvenient. I could hear it even in her breath. "You should think about getting a little safe," she told me once, while pretending to look for her car keys on the counter. "You worry less that way." I almost laughed, but the sound wouldn't come. I understood then that she was trying to reframe everything, to turn my loss into my confusion. It's easier to manage a mother who misplaces things than one who notices the cracks in your family's decency. The following months slid by like pages in a book someone else was reading aloud in a dull voice. Leo finished school, stopped coming by, and every time I asked about him, I got vague answers. "He's busy," or "You know how teenagers are." But I knew. You don't raise a child, bandage his knees, help him with homework, teach him how to stir soup without spilling, and then fail to recognize when he's drifting somewhere dangerous. His laugh at that dinner kept replaying in my mind. Not cruel, not demonic, just empty. The kind of laugh you give when you've already begun to unlearn remorse. I kept wondering what would have happened if I had grabbed his wrist that day. If I had said, "Don't become this." But mothers, real mothers, and grandmothers even more so, live by the terrible superstition that silence can still protect. The neighbors began to notice small changes before I did. One of them, a woman named Jean, who sometimes borrowed sugar from me, said one morning as we crossed paths by the mailboxes, "Haven't seen your grandson around lately." I told her he was busy with school. She smiled politely, the way people do when they sense a wound you're trying to hide. I avoided her after that. It was easier to let people think I was eccentric than pitiful. I busied myself with rituals, watering the same 2 plants on the windowsill, even when one was clearly dying, ironing dish towels that didn't need ironing, polishing the empty jewelry box as if its shine could make it whole again. I found comfort in repetition, in predictable tasks that didn't talk back. But under that rhythm, something else was happening, something quieter but sharper. I began to notice all the ways the world edits old women out of their own stories. When I went to the grocery store, cashiers would address me with that bright falseness, calling me sweetheart, as if my age had shrunk my dignity. Once, I heard a young woman behind me whisper to her friend, "She looks just like my grandma, poor thing," as if existing past 70 was a form of tragedy. I went home and sat in front of the mirror and looked at myself. My hair had thinned at the temples. The skin on my neck had folded into soft lines, but my eyes were the same ones that had once stared down a bank officer who didn't think a woman could negotiate a mortgage. Poor thing indeed. One afternoon, the building manager knocked on my door to tell me they were increasing the rent again. He said it quickly, apologetically, as if we both understood this was how the world punished anyone who lived too long. I nodded and thanked him, then closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the weight of being politely erased. I could afford the increase for now, but the math in my head was starting to tighten. I'd given my daughter money a few times over the years, small, temporary loans she never remembered as loans. And though I told myself I didn't mind, I did. There is a special kind of humiliation in realizing that generosity has been mistaken for an infinite resource. Around that time, I began receiving strange calls late at night. The phone would ring, And when I answered, there was nothing on the other end but static and breathing. At first, I thought it was telemarketers, but the pattern repeated, always around the same hour, always when I had just turned off the lights. Once I thought I heard music faintly in the background, a radio maybe, or the echo of a car passing by wherever the caller was. I didn't tell anyone. My daughter would have said, "You imagine things," and maybe she would have believed it. I wasn't even sure myself what was real anymore. But I started writing the time of each call in a small notebook, the way you write symptoms when you're trying to explain your pain to a doctor who doesn't quite listen. The apartment grew smaller each week. The noise of the laundromat below used to comfort me, but now it grated. The endless thump of wet clothes spinning, the hum of dryers, the sound of quarters dropping into metal slots. It was a lullaby turned hostile. Sometimes I would walk at night, down to the park a few blocks away, where the air smelled faintly of soil and old leaves. There, I could sit on a bench and remind myself that the world still existed beyond my memories. The trees didn't care about missing jewelry or disappointed daughters. They stood indifferent, patient, shedding and regrowing without apology. I envied that simplicity. One evening near dusk, I saw Leo across the street. He was walking fast, hood up, hands in his pockets, head down. He didn't see me, or pretended not to. I called his name once softly, but he kept walking. Something about the way he moved frightened me, that jitter in his steps, the hollow thinness in his cheeks. I went home shaken. That night I took the jewelry box from the dresser, held it in my lap and whispered to it, "It's only metal, isn't it? Only metal." But the emptiness inside it vibrated like a second heartbeat. After that, my daughter stopped calling even for the scheduled check-ins. Weeks passed, then months. When I finally reached her, she said she'd been overwhelmed with work. "You know how it is, Mom. I meant to visit." She sounded like someone talking about a dentist appointment they kept postponing. I said nothing, because the truth was I didn't want her visit anymore if it meant being handled like an errand. Silence, I discovered, can be its own revenge, slow, invisible, but effective. The isolation settled into me like a second skin. It didn't hurt in the obvious way. It dulled everything instead. I learned to live smaller, to take up less space, to lower my voice in public, to stop expecting mail that wasn't bills. But every so often, when the evening light slanted just right, catching the edge of that empty box, I'd feel the old defiance stir again. I would think of the women in my family who had been called gullible, sentimental, soft. My mother had been told those words too, and still she managed to raise me on little more than grit and borrowed hope. Maybe this was the inheritance we carried, to be underestimated and still endure. One morning, as I was leaving for the market, I found a folded flyer stuck under my door. It was for a local community meeting about senior safety and financial scams. The irony made me laugh, a dry laugh that startled even me. I thought about going, then decided against it. I didn't want to sit in a circle of strangers and be told how to avoid being tricked. I already knew the cost of trusting the wrong people. I was living it. Instead, I went to the thrift shop down the street and bought a second-hand brooch, a small piece of costume jewelry shaped like a bird in flight. It cost me $3. I pinned it to my coat that evening before going out for a walk. People looked at it and smiled politely, not knowing it was a declaration of sorts, my quiet rebellion. By the end of that year, the ache had dulled into something almost peaceful. I didn't talk about the theft anymore. My daughter assumed I had forgotten. But memory isn't a light switch. It's a slow-burning candle. I kept the notebook by my bed, where I recorded small details, what time the calls came, when the neighbors moved out, when I last saw Leo. I didn't know what purpose it served. Maybe just proof that I was still observing, still capable of connecting dots. The entries became like beads on an invisible chain, replacing the ones that had been stolen. Then one night, as I was writing, the phone rang again. I answered out of habit, expecting silence, but this time a voice spoke. "Grandma?" It was Leo's voice, lower, tired, trembling around the edges. For a second, my breath stopped. But before I could say anything, the line went dead. I sat there staring at the receiver, the old pulse of fear and love tangling in my chest. Maybe it was an accident, I told myself. Maybe he dialed the wrong number. But deep down, I knew better. The call was the first ripple of something beginning to shift, though I couldn't yet name it. After that, I slept differently, lighter, always half awake, waiting for the next call that didn't come. The days felt stretched and thin. Still, I went on. I cooked small meals, kept the apartment neat, kept the brooch polished. I had begun to understand something fundamental, that survival at my age wasn't about being strong, but about refusing to disappear quietly. Every morning when I looked in the mirror, I whispered, "You're still here," and the reflection nodded back, unconvinced but willing. I was, in my own slow way, beginning to prepare for the return of the past, though I didn't yet know that when it came, it would not ask permission. It was early spring when the first real shift happened, the kind of morning when the air still bites, but carries a hint of something softer behind it, like a secret waiting to thaw. I had opened all the windows to chase out the smell of winter, the damp weight that settles in old buildings and older bones, and I was sorting through drawers I hadn't touched in months. It wasn't an act of purpose at first, just the restless ritual of a woman who has too much time and too many ghosts in her room. I emptied boxes, folded scarves, wiped dust from picture frames. That's when I found it. An envelope wedged behind the drawer of my desk, yellowed at the edges, a little crumpled as if it had been shoved there in a hurry. I pulled it out, sat at the table, and unfolded it with the same care one gives to something sacred. Inside was a receipt from a pawn shop on Oak Street, dated nearly 5 years back, and scrawled at the bottom was a signature that made my stomach tighten in slow recognition. It was Leo's, his handwriting awkward but unmistakable, the way he always looped the L like a hook, the way the E trailed off like it didn't want to finish its word. The item listed, gold chain, blue stone pendant, the necklace, my husband's gift. For a long time I didn't move. The apartment seemed to hold its breath around me. Even the machines below went still in my mind, and I sat there in the half-light with that small piece of paper trembling between my fingers. I didn't feel the kind of rage one might expect. There was no scream rising, no curse, no desire for revenge. What I felt was an immense stillness, as though every sound in my life had suddenly receded to the horizon. It was not shock either. It was recognition. The truth had been circling me for years, tapping politely on the window, waiting for me to let it in. And there it was, finally seated across the table, plain as the ink on that receipt. My grandson had stolen from me. My daughter had chosen to pretend not to see. And I had built a small shrine to denial and called it family. I set the receipt down beside my cup of tea and stared at it until the steam faded and the liquid went cold. Then, with deliberate care, I picked up my notebook, the one where I had been recording the late-night calls, the sightings, the dates, and I wrote down the name of the pawn shop, the date, the price, and then underneath it, one sentence. Now I know what happened, but I am no longer the one who needs to explain it. That sentence changed the air in the room. It changed me too. For years, I had been living as if I were waiting for someone to grant me permission to feel wronged, as if pain required a witness before it could be real. But that morning, I understood something simple and devastating. I didn't need anyone else to believe me for it to be true. Truth does not dissolve because someone calls it inconvenient. I made myself another cup of tea, stronger this time, and watched the city stretch awake outside my window. People hurrying, cars sighing through puddles, pigeons fighting over crumbs. The world carried on exactly as it had before, indifferent to my revelation. But inside, I could feel the plates of my life begin to shift. I thought about going to the pawn shop, about walking in there and asking if they remembered him. I imagined the clerk, maybe someone young, maybe kind, saying, "Yes, I remember." A nervous boy was shaking hands. But I didn't go. I didn't need to. The receipt was enough. It wasn't proof I wanted anymore. It was peace. And peace, I was learning, doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from reclaiming the small pieces of yourself that were scattered in other people's pockets. That afternoon, I cleaned the apartment as though I were expecting company. I polished the table, washed the curtains, rearranged the pictures on the wall. I replaced the photo of my daughter and Leo with one of myself and my husband from the early years, taken in a field outside Portland, where the grass had been so tall it brushed our knees. I looked younger in that photo, not just in skin, but in certainty. A woman who still believed goodness guaranteed loyalty. I pinned it above my desk, just high enough to look at when I wrote. Then I began a new notebook. The first page I titled, "Record of What I Know." Not of what they said, or what they thought, or what they decided I should remember, just what I knew. I wrote slowly, deliberately, letting each line anchor me. I listed the dates, the dinners, the phrases, the laughter, the absences. I wrote about that Sunday when they all laughed at "Grandma Believes Everything." I wrote about the jewelry box, about the phone calls, about the silence that followed. I wrote until the sun began to slide across the floor in long orange stripes, and my hand ached from the effort. Then I closed the notebook, placed it in the drawer where the jewelry box used to sit, and felt something close to relief. For the first time in years, I felt I had taken something back. In the days that followed, I found myself moving differently. I walked slower but more upright, as though carrying a secret that steadied me. The neighbors noticed. Jean said, "You look well, Mary." "Have you been on a trip?" And I smiled and said, "Something like that." I started taking small walks to places I hadn't been in years, the public library, the park with the fountain, the bakery that still sold the same almond pastries from my working days. I wasn't searching for anything specific. I was reintroducing myself to the idea of being seen by strangers who didn't know my story and therefore couldn't rewrite it. One afternoon, I stopped at a cafe and ordered coffee. The young barista looked startled when I paid in cash. "You remind me of my grandmother," she said, handing me the change. "She used to carry real money, too." I smiled and told her to keep the coins. Her kindness was simple, uncalculated, and it made my chest ache with the strange joy of being treated as a person, not a responsibility. I sat there for a long time, watching people come and go, and realized that my solitude had stopped feeling like punishment. It was beginning to feel like space to breathe, to think, to remember, without bitterness. That evening, I went through my drawers again, not searching for anything lost, but looking for what might still be found. I came across the small sewing kit I hadn't touched in years and took it out. The thread was faded, but it would hold. I mended the torn pocket of my coat, replaced the missing button, and stitched the lining where it had frayed. There was something satisfying in the rhythm of the needle. in fixing what could still be fixed with my own hands. When I finished, I hung the coat by the door and looked at it with quiet pride. That coat had seen better years, but it had also survived them, and so had I. It was during those evenings that I began to understand the strange mathematics of endurance. That healing isn't about erasing the wound, but learning how to live with it as part of your story. I stopped expecting apologies that would never arrive. I stopped rehearsing the conversations that might have redeemed them. I let the silence sit, not as a punishment, but as a boundary. I didn't call my daughter, and she didn't call me. And for once, the absence didn't sting. It clarified. We were both free now, in our own unequal ways. Still, sometimes, when the moonlight caught the edge of my empty dresser, I felt the ache of memory pressing through the quiet. I would think of Leo, of his small hands when he was little, the way he used to climb into my lap and whisper secrets about the monsters under his bed. I would wonder when that boy disappeared and who took his place. But I didn't let the wondering turn into longing. Some people you have to love from a distance, the way you love stars, too far to touch, but still beautiful if you don't stare too long. One morning, I took the pawn receipt and slipped it into the notebook between 2 pages. It wasn't evidence anymore. It was part of the record. I didn't plan to show it to anyone, not even if they asked. Proof, I had learned, is wasted on those who prefer a comfortable lie. Instead, I began to plan small changes, quiet, deliberate ones. I called the bank and opened a new account in my name only. I went through my bills and canceled the automatic transfers I had once set up to help out my daughter. It wasn't revenge. It was arithmetic. You don't keep pouring into a cup that has already decided to leak. By the end of that month, I felt lighter, though not happy exactly. Happiness at my age is not a bright thing. It's a steady flame that doesn't go out when the wind picks up. I started writing letters to no one in particular. Letters to my younger self, to my husband, to the future I once imagined. I kept them in a shoebox under the bed, alongside my notebooks. Some nights I read them aloud, not for comfort, but for confirmation that my voice still existed. That spring turned into summer, and the city outside my window began to smell of heat and wet asphalt. I watched the children play below, the women hanging laundry, the men arguing good-naturedly about baseball, and I realized how long it had been since I laughed, not the polite kind of laugh, but the full, startled kind that breaks through without permission. I didn't know when it would return, but I felt, for the first time, that it might. And that was enough. I didn't know it then, but the world had already started turning me back toward the people who had once broken me. The line between past and present was beginning to blur again. But this time, I was no longer the same woman who believed everything. I was the woman who had learned to believe selectively, to believe in herself most of all. The pawn receipt lay quiet in the drawer, the notebook stacked neatly beside it, and I could feel the next chapter waiting at the edge of the light, patient, inevitable, already walking toward me. When the past finally came back, it did not arrive like thunder or police sirens or some dramatic knock that rattled the door off its hinges. It seeped in slowly, like damp through old walls, starting with a thin white envelope that did not look dangerous at all. I found it on the doormat one afternoon in late summer, slipped through the crack while I was making lentil soup and listening to the washing machines grumble below. No return address, my name written in a hand that tried very hard to be steady and adult, and failed in a way that I recognized so immediately my knees almost gave. I took it to the table, sat down, and opened it carefully. The paper inside was lined, torn from a notebook, the ink slightly smudged in places, as if someone had pressed too hard or stopped too long. "Grandma," it started. "No, dear. No, it's me." As if there had never been another person in his life he'd call by that name. The letter was short, halting, like each sentence had to fight its way through a tangle of shame before landing on the page. He wrote that things had been messy, that he was trying to get clean, that he knew I was angry about a lot of things, and that if I never wanted to see him again, he would understand. But he needed me to know one thing. It was me. The necklace, the other stuff. I took it. "I'm sorry. I was high. I was stupid. I thought you'd never notice or you'd forgive me like always. I don't expect anything. I just didn't want to die one day with you still not knowing the truth." There was no explanation about how he'd gotten my address, no plea for money, no promise of a bright, immediate transformation, just that admission, and at the bottom, his name, written the way he used to sign school drawings he'd proudly show me, except the loops were shaky now, like they'd been traced over a trembling hand. I read the letter 3 times slowly, my lips moving without sound. Then I set it down next to my notebook, next to the pawn receipt, next to all the dates and details I'd gathered like a quiet detective of my own life, and I felt something I had not expected to feel. Not vindication, not triumph, but a deep, exhausted tenderness, like watching a child finally point at the wound you'd seen all along. I did not rush to forgive him, but I also did not push the letter away. Instead, I slid it into the notebook between the pages where I had written about the night the jewelry disappeared, like someone filing a missing person report, and then, years later, adding the note, "Located." I did not call the number he'd scribbled at the corner. I boiled the soup until it thickened, ate a bowl alone by the window, and went to bed with the letter still echoing behind my eyes. In the weeks that followed, the world seemed to conspire to drag me back into the old orbit. My daughter called for the first time in months, her voice too bright, as if polishing every syllable. She asked how I'd been, whether I needed anything, whether I was managing okay up there all by yourself. All those words bending around the one thing she wasn't asking. Had I heard from him? When I told her I was well, she exhaled with a relief that sounded more like preparation than comfort. "Good," she said. "Listen, things have been difficult with Leo. He's going through a phase. It would really help if you didn't bring up old issues if you see him. He's fragile." The choice of word made me smile without mirth. Fragile. As if the boy who had stripped my dresser bare while I baked him lasagna was made of glass, and I, apparently, was made of stone. I did not tell her about the letter. It was not hers to have. She had made her choices back then, chosen where to place her doubt. Now I would choose where to place my truth. Not long after that, I learned from a neighbor with a television louder than his morals that there was an article circulating online, something about the opioid crisis and good families and unexpected struggles. My daughter had given an interview, it seemed, about the hardships of parenting a troubled son, the emotional toll, the therapy, the doctors, the hope, and the heartbreak. She looked tired and elegant in the photos, tilting her face just so, and when they quoted her, she said, "We've always tried to do what's best for Leo. Some influences from the past made it difficult." Influences from the past. I didn't need a law degree to recognize the soft accusation in that phrase. I found a printed copy of the article slipped into my mailbox like uninvited commentary from the universe. There it was in black and white. My grandson framed as a victim of vague shadows, my daughter framed as a warrior mother, and me written out, reduced to a cautionary absence. They didn't use my name, but they didn't have to. I recognized myself in the outline where the blame needed to live. I made tea and read the article twice. It was skillfully done, full of concerned phrases, and carefully measured vulnerability, the kind of public confession that invites sympathy without scrutiny. At the end, she said, "We're just praying for guidance." No mention of the jewelry, of course. No mention of the afternoon she stood in my bedroom and told me, "It's just things, Mom. Grief can make people dishonest. Survival can make them worse." I folded the article and tucked it into my notebook with the rest, not because I wanted to keep it, but because I wanted it where it could not rewrite my memory. Autumn came, and with it the familiar ache in my joints and the smell of wet leaves sneaking in through the stairwell. I had started helping for a few hours a week at the small library branch 3 blocks away, shelving returns and tidying up the reading room. The extra money was modest, but the real currency was being useful without being used. The librarians treated me like a colleague, not a child. They trusted me to lock up sometimes, to recommend books to nervous teenagers, to remind the old men at the newspapers that they weren't allowed to clip articles and take them home. It was there, one rainy afternoon as I was stacking biographies, that I heard my name, spoken quietly but distinctly in the doorway. "Grandma?" I turned, and there he was. Not the Leo from the family photos, not the smooth-faced boy with careless hair and the sly grin. This version of him was sharper and smaller at the same time, shoulders hunched as if bracing for impact, eyes ringed in tired blue, hands jammed into the pockets of a jacket that had seen too many nights and not enough washing machines. His hair was unkempt, his jaw rough, and there was a faint trembling in his left leg, like an engine idling unevenly. For a second, we just stared at each other, the weight of 5 lost years standing between us, like a table no one had cleared. "I shouldn't have come here," he said, looking past me, around me, anywhere but into my eyes. I wasn't sure if you got my letter." "I got it," I said. My voice surprised me. It was gentle, steady, not the brittle thing I had heard in my head. I set down the pile of books and wiped my hands on my skirt. A pointless gesture. "You look cold. Sit down." It felt strange, saying something so ordinary in the face of something so enormous. But ordinary is where most real things happen. He sat at one of the low tables where children usually colored. He couldn't seem to make his limbs fold correctly, like he had forgotten how to inhabit his own body. "I'm trying to get out of it," he said finally. "The stuff. I'm in a program. They said I should make amends." He laughed once, a broken sound that hurt my ribs. I figured I'd start with the easiest one. I let that sit there. Then I said, "You think I'm the easiest one?" He winced. "I didn't mean it like that. I mean, you were always," he trailed off. "The one who believed everything," I finished for him. I watched the words land. He flinched like I'd struck him, which I suppose in a way I had. "I was an asshole," he whispered. "I don't know why I did it. I mean, I do. I wanted the money, thought I could fix something quick, thought you'd never notice, and if you did, you'd just think you lost it. Mom said..." He stopped. "What did your mother say, Leo?" My voice was still calm. I could feel the librarians politely pretending not to listen. He rubbed his face. "She said you get confused, that you make things bigger than they are. She said it later when you called. She told me not to worry, that you'd forget." "I didn't," I said. "I wrote it down." He stared at me then, properly, for the first time, as if testing the reality of the woman in front of him. "I know," he said. "I know you didn't forget. And I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix it. I can't carry it anymore." Addiction is a thief with many hands, but none of those hands can sign a letter like the one he sent me, without something human guiding them. I knew enough, had seen enough in hospitals and waiting rooms in my life to recognize that what looked like confession might also be desperation. I asked him where he was staying. He named a shelter across town, the kind where you count your belongings before you sleep, and again when you wake. He mentioned the program again, the meetings, the sponsor. Then cautiously, as if stepping onto thin ice, he said, "I'm not asking you for money." That detail alone made me believe him more than any tear could have. "Good," I said, "because I'm not giving you any." He nodded, swallowed, waited for the punishment that didn't come. That was the first escalation of pressure, the moment he realized the rules had changed. I was no longer the grandmother who rushed to smooth every sharp edge, to cover for everyone else's mess. I was simply the woman he had wronged, sitting across from him in a library where the stories for once stayed on the shelves. We talked for a while longer, circling the wound without touching it directly. He told me a little about where he'd been, on friends' couches, in strange cars, in the wrong rooms with the wrong people. I told him about the library, the laundromat, the plants on my windowsill that refused to die. He laughed once, a real laugh this time, when I described scolding a man for trying to steal the crossword page before I'd copied it. But underneath the small talk, something heavy thrummed. When he left, he didn't try to hug me. He just stood there, awkward, and said, "Thank you for not slamming the door in my face." "I don't slam doors," I said. "I decide who's allowed to stand on the other side." "That's fair," he whispered, and then he was gone. I thought that would be the end of it. One encounter, one apology, and then life would fold back into its narrow pattern. But the past, once disturbed, rarely settles so neatly. A week later, my daughter appeared at my door without calling, her face tight, her lipstick too dark for daytime. She brushed past me into the apartment, the air around her buzzing with accusation. "You saw him," she said, not a question. "He told me. He said you were kind to him." "I was polite," I replied. "That's different. You're not helping," she snapped. And there it was, that familiar inversion, my existence turned into an obstacle in someone else's story. He needs consequences, Mom. He needs to see there are boundaries. "And what do you need?" I asked quietly. "An alibi?" Her eyes widened, then narrowed. "Don't start. You have no idea what we've been through." "Oh, I have an idea," I said. "I've read the articles." Color rose to her cheeks. "Those were to raise awareness." "They raised something," I said. "I'm just not sure it was the truth." For a moment, I saw the girl she used to be, the one who flung her arms around my waist at 9 years old because a teacher had been unfair, the one who believed I could fix anything. That girl flickered behind her gaze and then vanished. "If you coddle him, he'll use you," she said. "He always used you." "You taught him that," I said, before I could stop myself. Her mouth opened, then shut. She picked up her bag with shaking hands. "If he comes here asking for anything, you call me," she said. "Do you understand?" "I understand that he wrote to me before he talked to you," I said. "I understand that he admitted what he did. That's more honesty than I've seen from either of you in a long time." She left, slamming the door in the gesture I had refused earlier, her perfume lingering in the hallway like offended flowers. I stood there, leaning on the table, feeling the reverberation of that exchange settle into the floorboards. The pressure was building now from both sides, a grandson clawing at redemption, a daughter clawing at control, and me in the middle, no longer content to be the soft thing they tossed between them. The third blow came by mail again, this time in the form of a thick envelope from a legal office I didn't recognize. Inside was a carefully worded letter expressing concern about my financial decisions, suggesting a conversation about protective arrangements, hinting in polite terms that my assets, modest though they were, might need safeguarding from potential exploitation. My daughter's name appeared twice, delicately framed as a loving advocate. Leo's name did not appear at all. The implication lay naked between the lines. The old woman is at risk. Someone responsible should step in. It was almost elegant, the way they tried to wrap control in the language of care. Almost. I sat down with that letter, with Leo's apology, with the pawn receipt, with the article, with my notebooks. The pattern was no longer a puzzle. A cornered boy trying to crawl back toward the light. A cornered mother trying to ensure her history was written with the right amount of sympathy. A legal suggestion that I hand over the small remnants of my autonomy to the same people who had laughed when I first felt the ground give way. That was the true second escalation. The moment the quiet cruelty of the past evolved into a structured attempt to fold me back into their narrative, to certify my role as unreliable witness to my own life. I did what I have always done when no one is listening. I wrote. That night, the machines downstairs roared and clanged, the pipes rattled like distant thunder, and I sat at my table with a cheap pen and a clean page and recorded everything calmly, fact by fact. I wrote what they proposed, what they implied, what Leo had confessed, what my daughter had said in my kitchen, what the article had framed as influences from the past. The more I wrote, the clearer it became that they were all, in different ways, afraid of blame, of exposure, of losing whatever fragile grip they had on the version of events that hurt least to believe. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, I set the pen down and looked at the stack of pages. My hands were sore, my eyes dry, but my mind had never felt sharper. The escalation had done something unexpected for them. It had forced me to wake up fully. I was no longer drifting in the willful half-sleep of relatives who accept whatever story keeps the peace. They wanted me confused, malleable, grateful. Instead, I was in possession of a clear timeline and a quiet fury that did not shout but did not move aside either. When the phone rang the next morning and I saw Leo's number, I hesitated only once before answering. His voice was thinner than in the library, like the night had scraped it. "Grandma, Mom's mad I talked to you," he said. "She says you'll drag up stuff that's not helpful. I don't know who to listen to." "Then don't listen," I said. Look at what? At what you did, at what she did, at what I did, at what's true. That's your work, not mine. I know where I stand." He was quiet for so long I thought the line had dropped. Then he said, very softly, "Do you hate me?" I closed my eyes. In that pause lived every night I'd walked him as a crying infant, every sandwich I'd wrapped for his school lunches, every stupid joke he'd shared, every lie, every theft, every letter. "No," I said, "I don't hate you. Hating you would be easier. I'm asking you to grow up, that's all." "I don't know how," he said. "I know," I replied. "But you started when you wrote that letter. Don't stop now." When we hung up, I understood with a kind of calm devastation that this was not a story where everyone would sit in a circle and forgive each other by the final page. This was a story in which each of us would have to choose a self and live with it. The second escalation wasn't in the yelling or the letters or the threats of legal guardianship. It was in the way all their choices pressed against mine, forcing me to decide whether I would go back to being their soft landing or finally become my own. The day everything came together began with the kind of gray morning that doesn't pretend to be anything else. The sky was low and heavy. The laundromat downstairs hummed like a patient animal, and the steam from my kettle clouded the small kitchen window until it looked as if the world beyond it had decided to disappear. I had slept badly, waking in fragments, the way old women do when their dreams start carrying too many real faces. The letter from the lawyer, my daughter's visit, Leo's trembling voice, all of it kept circling in my head like restless birds. For weeks, I had felt the pressure mounting, as if some final act were waiting for me just outside the door, and I kept wondering whether it would arrive as confrontation or as silence. It turned out to be both. It started with a call from the library, where I still worked part-time. The manager, a kind woman named Fiona, said that a young man had stopped by asking for me, that he seemed upset but harmless, and that she had told him where I lived. I thanked her without letting my voice betray what I felt. I put down the phone, straightened the tablecloth, and waited. I didn't pace or pray. I just waited, the way you do when you know the story has decided it's time to reach its truth. The knock came around noon, 3 short taps and a pause, hesitant, like someone who still wasn't sure they were welcome. I opened the door, and there he was. Leo stood on the threshold, thinner than ever, soaked through from the drizzle, clutching a plastic grocery bag that sagged with something heavy inside. His eyes were swollen, the whites veined red, his face unshaven, his lips cracked. But there was no madness in him now, no bravado, just exhaustion so profound it looked almost clean. "I didn't know where else to go," he said. "I thought maybe you'd still—" He trailed off, staring at his shoes. I stepped aside and let him in. He smelled of wet wool and cheap cigarettes, the scent of someone who has been sleeping in too many borrowed places. I pointed to the chair by the table. "Sit," I said, and he obeyed like a child. For a while neither of us spoke. I poured tea, the ordinary kind, no sugar, and placed the cup in front of him. He wrapped his hands around it as if the heat alone might forgive him. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse but steady. I tried to fix it. The necklace, the bracelet. I found one of the shops where I sold them. The guy still had the ring. Your mother's ring, the one with the white stone. I bought it back. He opened the bag and pulled out a small velvet pouch, damp at the corners. He placed it on the table between us like an offering at an altar. My breath caught, not from shock, but from recognition. I reached out, opened the pouch, and there it was, the opal ring, duller than before, the metal tarnished, but unmistakably hers, the same faint crack along the band, the same quiet glow when it caught the light. I ran my thumb over the stone, and for the first time in years, I felt tears rise without bitterness. "How did you pay for it?" I asked. He hesitated, then said, "I've been working at a diner, washing dishes mostly. My sponsor helped me get the job. I've been clean 8 months." He said it simply, not as a plea, not as a badge, just as a fact. I nodded, still tracing the edge of the ring. 8 months is good, I said, but it doesn't erase 5 years. "I know," he whispered. "I can't change what I did." "No," I said, "but you can decide what you do next. That's the only real change anyone ever gets." He looked at me then, eyes wet. I was so scared to come here. "Mom said you'd never want to see me again." I smiled faintly. Your mother underestimates both my memory and my endurance." He laughed through his tears, a sound that hurt to hear because it was so close to the boy he used to be. Then he grew serious. "She's mad at me for coming. She thinks you'll use this against her. She says you keep notes about everything, that you're building a case or something." "I'm not building a case," I said. "I'm building a record. There's a difference. Cases are for courts. Records are for truth. They keep things from disappearing." He nodded slowly, then lowered his head. "I don't want to disappear." "You won't," I said. "Not if you keep telling the truth. Not if you keep standing where it hurts instead of running." For a long moment we sat in silence. The ring glimmered faintly between us. The kettle hissed in the background, and the city outside kept breathing, indifferent but alive. Finally, I picked up the ring and held it out to him. His eyes widened. "No," he said quickly. "It's yours. I brought it back." "I know," I said, "and I'm giving it back to you. You bought it once with shame. Now take it with understanding. Keep it until you've earned the right to return it for good." He shook his head. "I don't deserve." "Deserve has nothing to do with it," I said. "It's about weight. You need to carry some of what you broke. Otherwise, you'll forget the shape of it." He took the ring reluctantly, his fingers trembling. He looked down at it as if it were alive. "It feels heavier than I remember," he murmured. "It should," I said. "That means you're starting to feel the right things." He nodded, then covered his face with his hands. For the first time since he walked in, he cried, not the loud, messy tears of manipulation, but the quiet kind that leak out when the body can't hold any more. I didn't move to comfort him. I just let him cry, because some wounds don't want a witness, only space. When he finally looked up, his face was raw and open. "I thought if I told you everything, you'd hate me," he said. "But you're being kind." "Kindness is not forgiveness," I said. "It's clarity. I'm done punishing myself for what other people chose to do. That's all this is." He took a shaky breath. "I think Mom's scared. She thinks you'll tell people what happened, that you'll ruin her." "I don't have to ruin her," I said softly. "She's already done the work. The truth has a way of finding the door." He winced. "She's still my mom." "I know," I said. "And she's still my daughter. Nothing changes that. Blood is stubborn, even when love runs thin." The words hung there, honest and heavy. He reached across the table then, not for my hand, but for the cup of tea I'd left untouched. He took a sip, grimaced at the bitterness, then smiled faintly. "Still no sugar," he said. "Still no sugar," I replied. "Some things I don't change." After that, he stayed for a while. We talked about small things, the job, the program, the weather, the library. He asked about the plants, and I showed him the one that had miraculously revived after almost dying. "You just keep watering," I said, "even when you think it's over." When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated by the door. "Will you come to one of the meetings?" he asked. "You don't have to talk. Just sit there. It helps when people show up." I considered it. The idea of sitting in a room full of strangers confessing their failures sounded both terrifying and strangely honest. "Maybe," I said, "but if I come, I'll be there as myself, not as your forgiveness." "That's enough," he said. "That's more than I expected." He stepped forward then, slow, uncertain, and I let him hug me. It wasn't a cinematic embrace. It was awkward, damp from his jacket, but it was real. His heartbeat was fast against my chest, the same rhythm I used to count when he was a baby asleep in my arms. When he pulled away, I saw something in his face I hadn't seen since those days, an unguarded gentleness, the first flicker of a man who might still be built from the wreckage of the boy. After he left, I sat down and exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. The apartment felt both emptier and fuller, as if some trapped air had finally escaped. I went to the dresser, opened the drawer, and took out the jewelry box. The velvet was still worn, the hinge still cracked, but it no longer looked like a grave. I placed the small velvet pouch inside, the one he had brought me, now empty of the ring. Then I closed the lid, not as a gesture of finality, but of completion. That night, I didn't write in my notebook. I didn't need to. The act had already been recorded in a deeper place. I brewed myself another cup of tea, opened the window despite the chill, and let the city sounds drift in. The hum of engines, the faint laughter from the bar down the street, the rain tapping softly against the fire escape. I felt the quiet spread through me, not the oppressive kind that had haunted my earlier years, but the stillness that follows a long storm. It was not peace exactly. It was something sturdier, something earned. Later, before bed, I found myself standing in front of the mirror. I studied my face, the lines carved there by time and worry and endurance. I thought of the word believe, how it had been used against me, how it had once been a wound, and how now it felt like a choice again. I still believed, not in blind goodness, not in the safety of blood, but in the slow, stubborn work of becoming whole. That belief, at last, belonged only to me. A few days later, a letter arrived from my daughter. It was brief, formal, full of defensiveness wrapped in apology. She wrote that she had heard Leo had visited me, that she hoped it had gone smoothly, that she was glad he was taking responsibility. At the end, she wrote, "I know things got complicated. I just want you to remember that I did my best." I folded the letter and put it in the drawer without reading it again. I didn't need to respond. Some closures don't require answers. They require silence sturdy enough to stand on. That evening, I walked outside for the first time in weeks. The air smelled of rain and exhaust, the trees along the street dripping with the last light of sunset. I passed the pawn shop on Oak Street. Yes, it was still there, its windows dim, its sign half burned out. For a moment, I paused in front of it. Through the glass, I could see rows of watches, chains, instruments, all those small tokens of desperation waiting for redemption. I didn't go in. I simply stood there, watching my own reflection among the objects, an old woman, framed by a world that had taken much from her and still failed to take her dignity. Then I turned and walked home. When I returned to my apartment, the machines below were already starting their nightly rhythm, a heartbeat I had come to know better than any lullaby. I poured myself a glass of water, sat by the window, and looked at the lights flickering in the distance. Somewhere out there, Leo was wearing that ring, and somewhere else my daughter was rehearsing her version of our lives, and both of them were, in their own ways, still trying to find a version of love that didn't hurt. I let them go, gently, into whatever future they could manage. The climax of my story was not the confrontation, or the tears, or the return of the stolen thing. It was this, the quiet moment of choosing not to remain small inside someone else's memory. The jewelry was gone, found, gone again, and still I remained. I was the only thing that had not been pawned. The days that followed carried a softness I hadn't felt in years, as if the world itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. Nothing miraculous happened. The city kept its usual rhythm. The distant sirens, the laughter from the bar across the street, the mechanical sighs of the dryers below me. But inside my small apartment, the air seemed lighter, rearranged somehow, like a room after a long. Illness finally cleared of stale air. I began to move slower, not from weakness, but from an unfamiliar calm that had replaced the constant vigilance I had lived under for so long. It was strange to realize that peace, when it comes at last, doesn't arrive with music or applause. It comes like dusk, quietly, and if you're not paying attention, you might mistake it for loneliness. I didn't mistake it. I knew what it was. Each morning, I took to writing at the kitchen table with the window open, letting the city's noises mingle with the scratching of my pen. I wasn't keeping a record anymore. That work was finished. But I wrote small things, fragments of thought, memories that surfaced like gentle ripples, small confessions to no one in particular. I found myself writing not about betrayal, but about endurance, about how survival isn't one big decision, but a series of small ones you make every day without fanfare. Some afternoons, I would read those pages aloud, my voice unhurried, steady, and in the echo of my own words, I would hear something unfamiliar, not the tremor of anger or pain, but the weightless sound of self-respect. One Sunday, I went back to the park where I used to sit during the worst of it, the place where I had once envied the trees for their indifference. The leaves were beginning to turn again, golden edges curling like old photographs. I took a seat on the same bench and watched children chase each other across the grass, the same way Leo used to when he was small, and the world still believed he could do no wrong. I wondered whether he remembered those days, the picnics, the sandwiches, the way I would hold his hand too long when we crossed the street. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. Memory is fickle like that. It favors what makes survival easier. But I knew now that my own memory was no longer a wound. It had become a story I could hold without flinching. Sometimes I still thought about my daughter. I tried to picture her life as it was now, neat and efficient, full of schedules and explanations, the kind of life that leaves no room for guilt to grow wild. I didn't hate her. Hate requires energy, and I had finally learned how to keep mine for myself. I wished her a quiet kind of clarity, the sort that doesn't depend on other people forgetting what you did. Perhaps she would find it someday, perhaps not. Either way, it was no longer mine to oversee. The burden of being the family's conscience had fallen from my shoulders without ceremony, and in its absence, I discovered something unexpected: freedom, pure and unadorned, the freedom of not having to convince anyone of my truth. At home, I placed the jewelry box on the windowsill where the light could reach it. The ring was gone, of course, but the box no longer looked empty to me. It had become a small altar to what I had reclaimed: the right to define my own worth, the dignity of having endured without turning bitter. I sometimes opened it just to see the velvet gleam in the sun, to feel the weight of air inside it, the absence that was now somehow full. The box had changed meaning. It was no longer about loss, but about measure, a reminder that even the smallest container can hold the largest truths. One evening, close to winter, I heard footsteps on the stairs and then a knock. My heart leapt, not from fear, but from recognition of life continuing. When I opened the door, no one was there, only a small envelope resting on the mat. Inside was a folded note in Leo's handwriting. "Still clean," it said. "Still working. I'll bring the ring home when I'm ready." That was all. No promises, no apologies. I read it once, smiled, and placed it inside the jewelry box. The circle had not closed, but it had tightened just enough for me to rest within it. That night, I sat by the window as the laundromat below went quiet for the first time in hours. The red neon sign flickered, painting the walls in faint waves of color. I brewed tea, the same way I always did, and watched my reflection in the glass, an old woman in a blue sweater, hair pinned back, eyes steady and unafraid. I thought of the phrase that had haunted me all these years: Grandma believes everything. How small and cruel it had once sounded. How foolish they had made it seem. But now as I looked at myself, I whispered it aloud again, and it no longer stung. Yes, I still believe, not in people's excuses, not in the safety of blood, but in my own endurance, in the slow mercy of truth, in the possibility of repair, even when the shape of what's broken can never return to what it was. Belief, I realized, had never been my weakness. It was my inheritance, the thing that kept me alive long enough to turn their cruelty into comprehension. Before bed, I wrote one last note in my notebook, the same way I had started everything, simple, unpolished, unafraid of sentiment. They said I believed everything, I wrote. Maybe I do, but belief is not blindness. It is light, small, persistent, enough to see by. Then I closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and let the darkness fill the room, soft and familiar. In the stillness, I could hear the faint hum of the city, the distant engines, the rhythm of living that goes on, regardless of who leaves or stays. I lay down, my body tired but not defeated, and thought of all the women like me, scattered across the world, the quiet ones, the dismissed ones, the ones whose stories get rewritten until they sound like footnotes to someone else's narrative. If any of them could hear me now, I would tell them this: you don't owe anyone your silence, and you don't need anyone's permission to start again. There is a kind of strength that grows only after humiliation, a kind that no one can steal, not even the ones who took everything else. That strength is invisible, but it shines through your eyes when you stop apologizing for having survived. When I finally closed my eyes, the last thing I saw was the faint glow of the streetlight spilling across the jewelry box. It looked like a small patient flame, steady and unwavering. I thought of it as my heartbeat made visible, the pulse of a life that had bent but never broken. Whatever waited for me beyond that night, I was ready. I had lived through the betrayal, the theft, the silence, and the long return to myself. And in the quiet of that moment, with the hum of the city beneath me, I understood at last that forgiveness is not something you give away. It's something you grow into. I had grown into mine.